Okay. I decided to re-record the Resident Evil discussion from earlier, since my microphone clearly failed during that. But, as a nice bonus, you may have noticed that my microphone sounds a bit better. More accurately, that there's not that background noise we've been used to. I finally found the USB microphone I've been talking about. I was doing a bit of hacking today, and lo and behold, it was in one of the boxes I was using. So, here we are. So I'm going to redo the script. Unfortunately, I did do a lot of on-the-spot with the script earlier. So there may be a few details I don't do that I did during the initial recording. If you want to try and bear through the initial staticky recording, you can. But I'm going to try and go through all the same general basic ideas in this recording. And I apologize for that recording. Basically, in the past, I used to occasionally during the stream stop, go into Twitch Studio, and check the sound quality, but every time I did, it would quadruple the feedback sound. This, of course, is terrible because the feedback sound is bad enough as is. Alright, so I'm just gonna do this as if I was doing a fresh recording. Opening rant done. I'll just put a timestamp in the description for 2 minutes and 10 seconds. Today we are discussing my best theories for the coming killer and survivors for the coming Resident Evil chapter. Some of these ideas may come as somewhat of a revelation to some of you. You may even need to remake some of your theories. But you do know what they say about the classics. Beware spoilers for all Resident Evil games, for realsies. Also, I'm trying to avoid the V word and certain other words. Thank you. I am the Story Sleuth, and today I'm talking about the coming chapter in Dead by Daylight. First, I'm going to talk about the killers, then the survivors, and finally, my final long-shot secret theory characters. Stick around for that, dear listeners. For killers, I'm going to mostly try to theorize about weapons, mori, and reasons why they might be there. Anything else depends on what comes to mind for me. Now, on to our potential killers, in no particular order. We'll start with Eveline from Resident Evil 7. Now, Dead by Daylight lacks a creepy child so far, and could easily flash between child and creepy old lady as she walks, like the spirit phases in and out of existence while she walks, for that extra added creep factor. For effectiveness, she would likely be paired with a member of the Baker family, likely Lucas due to his shown inborn issues, and you would switch between them like with the twins. Eveline would likely be able to alter the survivor's view of reality, making them see generators that aren't there, hearing false heartbeats, and seeing other survivors as Lucas, or maybe seeing Lucas as a survivor, until he gets too close at least. Perhaps being injured would make you immune to the effects of Eveline. I feel this one isn't too likely, but I felt it should be mentioned as within the realm of possibility due to a very likely possibility for one of the survivors who we'll get to later on in the recording, or re-recording in this case. Both Lucas and Eveline are dead and are therefore free to be killers in the game without any kind of issues with their canon appearances in the mainline games. Eveline's weapon could be a slow toxin, or using the mold like a delayed range weapon, similar to how the Pyramid Head functions. While herself being physically weak to a survivor could allow them to potentially disable her. Meanwhile, Lucas, he could easily trap pallets, windows, and doorways with his engineering capabilities and knowledge of traps and mechanics, by making blade traps that would clasp onto doorways and windows and pallets, even once they've been deployed. So when someone tries to use one, they would end up with a deep wound or even just getting damaged. Personally, I would see it more as you would go through several of them, and each time you go through one, your mending gauge would reduce, giving you less and less time to mend. So that there's a chance that even if you do get away from the killer, you might collapse anyway. Or take damage regardless. So it could be interesting. I would also like to say that Lucas on his own is on the table, but then he may be too close to the Trapper. Unless they take him as his transformed molded self, in which case they could keep him with his traps, but then that wouldn't make much sense for him to be transformed into his molded self. But then again, maybe he could have other powers as well. Bit hard to say. As for reasons why they would agree to work with the entity, however, well, Eveline wants a family. It's ingrained into her very being. It's basically an addiction that she wants to have a family, and Lucas has always had a sadistic streak that could easily be quenched by doing this. The entity could promise both of them this, but as to how far that would convince them is hard to really say. Next is one I personally really hope for, and I'm sure most of you want as well. Good old pursuer from the European division of the Umbrella Corporation with a grand old production total of 1, we have the Nemesis from Resident Evil 3. Hopefully the classic version, but if not, then hopefully the head and hopefully body can be a cosmetic we can buy. Convincing Nemesis to work with the entity could be difficult, however, the NE parasite is intelligent enough to potentially be manipulated. Or at the very least is self-serving enough to be set loose upon the survivors to reliably and understandably kill them. His power would probably be to use his tentacle to trip survivors, stunning them and to pull himself across far distances quickly. I can easily foresee him using the poles that extend up from the generators as whipping points to grapple to. Survivors will likely only get an audio cue of hearing that whip flip out and then wrap around with the generator kind of jiggling a bit, and then just an 8.5 foot tall behemoth just slams down beside them with that roar of stars. Or maybe survivors. That would be rather terrifying, wouldn't it? Now, the NE parasite itself could factor in as part of the power, slowly killing and maybe even controlling survivors like Victor of the Twins or the Tyrant Virulent infection as a synthesis of the game mechanics introduced by the Plagway, another word I'm trying to avoid, and the pig, slowly building up and killing survivors unless cured. His Mori would likely be the classic tentacle through the head kill from the original RE3 that we saw in Brad in that cutscene. Brutal and classic. Hard to pass up, really. His weapon will likely just be his fists or his tentacles. Man, I am saying tentacles a lot. Is this okay for TOS? Yeah, I'm sure it's fine. Next is the main antagonist from one of the more recent Resident Evil games, and someone I misname dropped in a past stream. Whoops. Mother Miranda. Now, I know who most people want from Resident Evil 8, and we will be discussing her too. However, Mother Miranda, who in a previous stream I called Lady Maria, whoops, sorry, Billborn, is much more powerful than Lady Double Domitrescu, and has more control over the Megamycete. As well as her religious fervor towards the mold could easily be bent just like it was with the Plagway, especially when you look and see that the Megamycete and the entity share physical similarities such as coloration, shape, and their blooms. Her power would be difficult to pin down as she has shown a number of them throughout her game. Maybe she could take the shape of a survivor until she transforms back to attack. Perhaps she can make spires of mold to block paths or hold and trap pallets and windows. Her Mori would probably be to rip out someone's heart and squish it on her face as we saw in the game. But as for the powers, it could be similar to how they balanced out the Clown and simply have powers you can swap between, maybe with a cooldown when you use any given one. Now, her weapon would likely be her long claws from her boss form. And as for her motivation, it would probably be to get her perfect daughter, her Ava, back from the dead. Eddie could easily offer her this, whether it's a lie or not, and that would likely be enough to at least convince her, especially if she were to believe that the entity was simply the Megamycete in its true form. And after her death, she may simply believe that this is what happens when you die under the influence of the Megamycete. That becoming part of the catalog of memories within it is simply the realm of the entity. Wouldn't be too hard for her to believe that. after everything she's seen. Now, next we have many people's favorite candidate due to her huge list of potential features. Lady Alcina Dimitrescu. Now, she is one of the more popular candidates for reasons that to some are obvious, those being that she possesses two major traits necessary for any successful soon-to-be franchise. Bust out thriller of a killer. A Mori's signature weapon, of course. Clearly her retractable claws make an excellent, distinct weapon, and the grasping a survivor for a quick beheading or blood draining would make a clear and distinct Mori. To top it off, she may just be a clear candidate for the tallest killer. I think a perk involving hits delivered or kills performed that increases her effectiveness somehow would be likely. Perhaps Poise, which as stacks are gained reduces terror radius by so many meters per stack, or Fill the Casks, which increases spread by % per stack, or maybe reduces the amount of time and chases required to reach the next stage of Bloodlust. It would reflect her nobility roots or her vampirism, respectively. Now, next up are the Dimitrescu's daughters. Though I guess they are kind of sisters, but daughters is what I meant to say. Honestly, though, I'm not as sold on this as some others are. I mean, maybe? However, they don't truly bring too much to the table that makes them really unique to Dead by Daylight. From what I've seen, they can turn invisible by turning into an insect swarm. But the Wraith can do that without the telltale buzzing. And if the entity were to take someone, why wouldn't they take their more powerful mother, or even Mother Miranda, who has a direct connection to the far more powerful Megamycete? Perhaps they have a unique trait that I'm just not seeing, or that I never saw, or that I don't know about. And I would love to be disproven. But regardless, onto their weapons, they wield hand scythes that are dripping of blood and black with rust. As for the Moris, they would likely disappear into an insect swarm, and the survivor would sluggishly climb to their feet, kind of similar to how Freddy would disappear, before being pulled back by a scythe and having their blood drain either by a mouth, bite, or scythe across the throat. Now, next up, he has been a boss on and off in mainline games and sideline games throughout the series. A few others have talked about their deep lore roots, which gives them some cred. Here they are, The Tyrant and Mr.X, series of BOWs. Premiering in Resident Evil 1 and then being improved upon and transformed further into the Mr.X series for Infiltration by RE2. These mass-produced BOWs are being introduced together due to Mr.X being made from a modified Tyrant and sharing many traits. Aside appearance, the biggest difference is that Mr.X will give it to you with his fists, while the Tyrant will stab you with his stabby hand. For Moris, Mr.X will crush the skull, while the Tyrant will impale the chest before throwing the survivor back down, as was most prominently seen in the Resident Evil Outbreak games, and specifically Decisions, if I recall. One of the instant kill attacks was this chest stab, lift up, drop kind of a attack. That would probably be what the Mori would be. Now, as for motivation, the Tyrant would make more sense due to its independent intelligence and its instinct to hunt and kill. So it could easily be convinced to kill survivors. Mr. X, however, it would depend on whether or not the entity could give it commands similar to how Umbrella can, through its implanted parasites and conditioning. In theory, yes. But in practice, who knows? I guess it all depends on whether or not this is the, enemy that's chosen. Now, on to our next potential killer. Known for his obsessive tendency towards a singular teammate, he would fit right in with our current roster of killers. It's none other than Albert Wesker. Now, firstly, he's dead, so he could easily be written into the entity's realm. Secondly, he was a mainstay antagonist for a lot of the series, so he has a deep lore and great popularity as well, so it would make sense for him to be a killer. Now, for his power, he does have, of course, the ability to dash quickly and punch with bone-shattering force. Plus, like all killers, he does have a weakness to bright lights, but that makes him pretty close to the Blight. His weapons would probably end up being his bare hands and martial arts, with his Mori being his signature chest-impaling punch. Now, maybe for a difference he could use his custom handgun, but unless they want to make him overpowered, they would likely have to tone down the handgun's power to the point where it'd be a glorified BB gun. But the most interesting part is, a reason to work for the entity would clearly be the chance to be revived, or at least that's what the entity would offer. But anyone who understands Wesker's knows he would accept the deal with one hand, while constantly planning on how to sink a knife in the entity's back with the other. Wesker would never settle for mere resurrection. No, he seeks what he's always sought, godhood. And now he's closer than ever, with the entity so close you can reach out and caress it. All the better to strangle it off its throne and usurp it. So Wesker can take his rightful place. In his eyes, anyways. Now, next up, we have a major antagonist from the Revelation series. Alex Wesker. That's right, Alex, not Albert. From Resident Evil Revelations, number 2. Now, you would be forgiven if you had no idea who this was. She was the true antagonist behind the events in the sequel game and the Revelations games. Her madness and fear could make her easily bend to the entity's whims. Her grotesque forms, after affliction and transformation, would make her fit in perfectly. Her weapons could vary from her appendages to projectiles, lunges, and even some psychological weapons. Perhaps even a mechanic where you can't look at her or else you build up fear and need time to calm down for fear of screaming. However, as for other factors, it's a bit hard to pin down as she didn't have much time in her game as a true combatant. There were certainly her boss fights, but typically they were short, in an arena, a lot of running away more than actual full-on combat, though there was that helicopter sequence. Now, depending on the form she takes, the Mori would likely be scaring the target to death by holding them up and screaming, like she did to the girl in the earlier chapters, or crushing them to death in her hands, which she does in the later chapters. Now, before we go further, I would like to consider that, although we're only going to get one killer, and probably one or maybe two survivors, any that we don't get may be added as outfits, either as DLC or with the DLC, just like we got when we only got Bill from L4D, can't say the full name, as extras. So potentially, that could be an option. Also, if you like what you've been seeing or hearing so far, please consider subscribing or following to find future content and check out my other content. If you're on my Twitch, I have polls available for interaction, and leave a comment on YouTube or Twitter. Now, on to the survivor discussion. Firstly, there have been some rumors that there may be 2 or even more survivors, like what they did with Stranger Things chapter. Now, I'm not going to get into that, but I will list the people who I think will be most likely to make the cut, so to speak. I'd like to note that for the majority of the survivors we have seen in the game so far, with a few exceptions, such as Ash due to Necronomicon shenanigans, every survivor we get is either dead in their home universe, or they are, quote-unquote, never seen or heard from again. Due to this, I'm ruling out some of the series' mainstay and more prominent characters such as Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, Leon Kennedy, Clair Redfield, Sherry Birkin, and Rose Winters. Each of them are likely not going anywhere in their respective universes and stories for quite some time yet. However, I would love to be wrong and boulder punch the cannibal into the sun with Chris's perk, Boulder Punch, which lets you boulder punch the killer into the sun. So yeah, although I would love to play as those characters, it doesn't seem quite likely. So instead I will focus on the more likely and some of the less spoken about options, at least the ones I haven't heard much discussion about. So to start a very likely talk to death option, in a way literally, Ethan Winters, the now dead protagonist of Resident Evil 7 and 8. This military-trained everyman and father is now prime survivor material, especially if Miranda or Eveline becomes new killer due to a personal connection, as I mentioned before. If he becomes a survivor, it very much increases the odds that Eveline or Miranda would become the next killer. or at least a member of the Baker family or one of the house heads, like Lady Domitrescu or the Doll Lady, or even Heisenberg. Maybe the fish guy, but I think we've all seen enough of him. I think we have enough killers that vomit profusely. Because, as we've seen in the past, usually when a killer and survivor get introduced together, there's usually some kind of connection, even if you have to look for it a bit. Like, for example, with the Death Slinger and Zarina Kassir, when they got introduced together, Zarina was actually exploring the prison cell where the Death Slinger actually ended up getting taken from. She actually found his wrench, and that was the key that pulled her through. She went snooping around where apparently she shouldn't have been. We're all thankful that we got the For the People perk. Now, onto a perk I think he might get. He may get a healing perk. And personally, I would put a bet... Well, not a bet, but I'm thinking a good perk that would reflect his whole survival against impossible odds thing. Perhaps by staying within the terror areas while not in a chase, or maybe even while in a chase, would allow him to slowly begin to heal. Like after spending, I don't know, 60 seconds, 55, 50 seconds in chase, it allows you to heal one health stage up to 1 or 2 times a match. Something like that. I don't know, I'm just throwing it out there. Because, as we know, and again, I did say that there would be spoilers in this stream, he is a molded. So his healing ability is ridiculous. Now, him being brought back as a survivor might remove that whole healing ability, but it would kind of make sense with his backstory. And on top of this, another reason why he might be chosen as a survivor, basically an additional note here, is he was given a face texture, even though it can't be seen without affecting the camera using console commands. His face is never seen, ever, in-game, without being able to affect the camera and move it to a place it was never supposed to go. So, perhaps he was given one so it could be modeled by another company. Either that, or maybe they're playing some DLC soon. Like, Capcom's playing it for Resident Evil 8. We'll see. Now, next is someone you would be forgiven to have completely forgotten. He only having been mentioned occasionally by a few documents and characters in movies and games since his appearance in the one game he was in. At least in the main series. Billy Cohen, Resident Evil 0. Now, he was framed by his fellow soldiers and then, with the help of Rebecca Chambers, escaped into the woods and was never seen or heard from again. Now, tell me if this sounds familiar. A man who just escaped a bad situations wanders alone in the woods. Mist begins to envelop him, but he trudges forward until he comes to a place unfamiliar yet familiar, and a new horror begins. He's an ex-United States Marine, an escaped military prisoner, and a good man betrayed by his comrades. Due to his mysterious disappearance, he could be an excellent candidate for a survivor. As for perks, it's hard to say. He's definitely standoffish, but he's willing to work with essentially anyone. He wants to do the right thing. He's a kind of stand-up sort of person. He's willing to deny orders if it gets the right kind of outcome. So if he's chosen, I'm definitely wanting to see what they decide for his perks. Now, this next one would be up for serious debate because it all depends on where they take this character in the remake verse. If we stick with the original story, then he'd be perfect for a survivor, but where they take him in the remake verse, it's hard to say. And he's none other than Carlos Oliveira from Resident Evil 3, both original and the remake. Now, the reason I mention original and the remake is that in the original timeline, once they escaped Raccoon City, they went to the, I believe it was West Coast, had a drink at a bar with Jill to say goodbye, and then he fled the US via Mexico while harboring a hatred for Umbrella. But from there, he was never seen nor heard from again. So he'd be a good choice for Survivor. As for now, well, we don't really know. In the remake, they escape together in a helicopter. He has questionably a wound. He was shot, I believe, in the body armor, so he'd definitely have some bruising. Well, if the bullet penetrated, like if it didn't quite hit a plate, he might have an abdominal wound, in which case he could bleed out later. So if he dies, he would also be able to be a survivor that way. So essentially, all I can really say is there's a potential for him to be a survivor there. But it's hard to truly say for sure until the chapter really releases. At least in his case. Now, this next one's going to raise some eyebrows, and if chosen, it's probably going to burst a few eardrums. But Ashley Graham from Resident Evil 4. Now look. She is used to being thrown over shoulders and fleeing from killers. She was being a near helpless survivor before it was cool. Now, since Resident Evil 4, there have been mentions of her in documents and in some movies, but she's rarely ever appeared on screen. Her father was the president, but he was either voted out, or if he was Leon's friend still, then he died from the C. virulent infection in Resident Evil 6. Though it was never confirmed that that was the same president. Or at least, I don't think it was ever confirmed. In fact, I'm pretty sure his last name was Adams or something like that, so I'd have to double check that. I probably should have. Regardless, she hasn't been directly in the picture for a while, so I'd say she falls under the never seen or heard from again kind of purview. I think she might have been in like a mobile game a little while ago, but even then I think she was kind of a off-screen character. So she could be pulled into the entities realm that way. By the way, I'd just like to point out that I love how the entity could easily be kind of an aside joke. Like corporate entity. You know, buying properties from other universes. The killers from their respective universes. And making it part of their realm. Just saying, that's really clever if they intended to do that. Regardless, speaking of Resident Evil 4, our next survivor is Luis Serra. Now, he was a biologist living in not Spain. And he was sadly killed at the end of his appearance. But that would make him available for an appearance here. Though, with him here, there would be a chance for the Regenerator being the killer, and dear God, no. But with his knowledge of biology, medicine, science, that could be a number of different perks altogether. So, he would certainly be an interesting survivor to see, and I would definitely want to see what they do with him. Now, the next survivor isn't from RE4, but rather the next game, Sheva Alomar from RE5. Now, she has had a few mentions, the most recent being from RE6 in 2013. However, nothing really notable since then. So I'd say she's far enough out of the picture that she could be brought here through the never seen or heard from again rule, so I include her here. She certainly has a lot of traits that we'd look for in a survivor. The upbeat attitude, the hopeful demeanor, the nobody left behind sort of thing. So she could certainly fit in. But as I've said, we won't really know until that releases. I know, I haven't thought of too many perks for the survivors, but honestly, some of the perks are pretty hard to nail down. Especially since, well, these characters are most famous for toting around guns. Let's be 100% honest here. Once you take those away... I mean, they could always give them a perk that allows them to, like, charge into the killer to stun them, but... It'd be pretty hard to balance that without making it just straight up a stun lock for the killer. Maybe like a do it and you get injured kind of thing. Regardless, next we go all the way back to Resident Evil 3 for a man most memorable for his death, which was as explosive as it was memorable in both the classic and remake. Mikhail Victor from Resident Evil 3, a leader and mercenary under the UBCS alongside Carlos, mentioned earlier. He sacrificed himself to buy Jill Valentine time against the NEMESIS BOW. He and Bill would probably swap stories about fighting zombies and wars all over the world and keeping these idiot kids alive. Oh, I'd love to see that. Bill would finally have a comrade. All these stupid kids, they keep trying to fix generators, and I tell them no, we team up, we beat up the killer. Take him down and take down the entity. But no, they say Jen's first, friend's second. Bah, dumb cuffs. Now, as for the final survivor, I would have to say that it's not so much an individual but a group. Probably more likely to be as costumes for existing survivors, but the Resident Evil Outbreak File 1 and 2 characters. Now, any one of the characters could potentially be picked as an actual survivor, and with a huge cast, especially when you consider the extra characters, even if you just give them each a 1%, that still gives you a pretty high percent chance that one of them could be picked. However, I would like to say it'd be likely as a separate DLC to purchase a bunch of costumes. However, if that is the case, I would like to say that if you want to see a Resident Evil Outbreak remake, maybe consider purchasing it. Because it wouldn't be the first time that Capcom has paid attention to sales on a product to determine the future of a related product. And I, for one, would love to see a Resident Evil Outbreak remake. Because, good lord, I still own Resident Evil Outbreak File 1 and 2 on my PlayStation 2. It's currently packed away, but I would love to play that again someday. Apparently there are still servers being run online. You just gotta get a special client to run it. So I think it has to be run on a PC, so I have to look into that. Alright, and finally we get to the secret category. The both category characters. That's right. Characters that could be either killer or survivor depending on how the behavior chooses to spin them and how they choose to implement them. Now these characters are less likely, but if picked, all bets are off as to which they become. First, you'd be forgiven for forgetting him, having only one game to his name. Piers Nivens. Resident Evil 6. Resident Evil 6. The end of his tragic game, he ends up injecting himself with the C virulent infection to transform to electricity shooting infected mutant to allow himself to fight off a BOW that could wipe out the world, sacrificing himself to save everyone. It's a wonderful moment. Well, sad moment, really. And if he is brought in as a monster, he could easily be brought in as someone who's finally fully succumbed to his Resident Evil 6 transformation. Or he could easily be brought in as a survivor that has been relieved of his transformation after death. He's always been someone who has been shown to be focused and able to bring others back from the brink. So perhaps he would have a perk that would give him an aura that would allow him to focus people. Maybe bring them out of negative effects faster. Maybe allowing him to mend people quicker if they have negative debuffs. Or even reduce the effects of debuffs on people within, an aura around him. Something to do with teamwork. Actually, you know what? I think most of the survivors I mentioned could probably have perks to do with teamwork or working together. Except maybe Ethan Winters, who, now that I think about it, could probably also have a perk for being a lone wolf. Probably Billy Cohen as well. But Anyways, on to the other either-or person would be William Birkin. Now, if he's a monster, he would likely be in his partial human form or in his four-armed, fully transformed form. Now, if he's in his partial transformed form as a killer, his weapon would likely be a pipe, and his mori would likely just be a brutal, animalistic, crazed beating. In his fourth form, it would likely be just tearing into the person with his claws, and his weapon would be his claws. I can imagine that his attack would probably be some kind of charge. In like a straight line with a wide kind of attack. Like, two arms are charging while the other two are kind of like held out his sides to give him a really wide attack kind of area. Be what I think. And his human form, he would just be the researcher. And if he was chosen in his human form as a survivor, it would explain, or even in his monster form, it would explain the umbrella pin we found. Or if, Mikhail or Carlos was chosen, it would also explain the umbrella pin that gets dropped during the trailer we saw. So, those are my theorized choices for who the killers and survivors could potentially be. If you liked what you saw or heard today, please consider following, subscribing, liking, commenting.